Okay, welcome back to another Between the Pages book chat, and we are live with author Alma Alexander, and she's here to talk about her book, Changer of Days. And I'm going to turn it over to you now and let you introduce yourself. So take it away.
Hi, I'm Alma Alexander, and I write mostly fantasy. I write occasional science fiction. My first real science fiction novel just finaled in the Washington State Book Award this year, so I'm quite pleased about that. But when I started writing big books, Changer of Days was one of the first big epic fantasies that I wrote. In fact, it weighed in at a quarter million words. And essentially, what happened was when I took that into a publisher back in New Zealand, where I was living at the time, and just looked at this thing and he liked it, and he said, "Split it up, do two books because this is huge and this is just an enormous book." And I was this unknown, green, wet behind the ears writer, no name and no reputation and no standing, and they kind of went, "It's a nice book, we want to publish it, but ye gods, it's big, so split it up." So it was originally published as a duology. In New Zealand, it was Change of Days Volume 1 and Volume 2. When it came to be published in the United States as the duology, the first book was retitled by committee, as it were. And I remember having a lunch with an editor at that point. We were kind of batting titles back and forth, and we eventually ended up with one that neither of us really liked, but it was the only thing we could agree on. So it became The Hidden Queen. So The Hidden Queen and Changer of Days became the two books, the two duology books, which were essentially two halves of one mammoth novel. And these things went happily on along the way for a while. And then, in their wisdom, the publisher decided that the second book, the second half of the novel, which is now the eponymous Changer of Days, was going out of print. So now book one was out there by itself and ended on this utterly awful cliffhanger, which was never my intention because you're supposed to go to the next chapter, not the next book. But that's the way that the thing was published, and that's the way that things stood. So now we have a situation where book one, which is the first half of the book, which is the one with the cliffhanger, is technically in print. Book two is not. And I'm starting to get people writing and going, "What happened to the end of the story?" And I'm saying, it's not my fault. I can't really produce it. But eventually, after about 7 years worth of trying, I finally got the first book to revert. And what I have now done is I have produced a 20th anniversary edition of the novel, Changer of Days, for the first time, as it should have been in the beginning, as a single volume, all 250,000 words of it. And that's coming out in November. And I'm really looking forward to sharing this thing properly, the way it should have been said in the first place. I mean, in the process of re-putting it back together again, of course, I've been through it 4 times, and it's been re-edited, and I've taken some things out and put some things back in, and I've changed it a little bit and made it, 20 years have passed, and I am a different writer now. So I did fix it in certain things, but the bones of it are there. The bones of the story are still very much what they were when I wrote it, and I'm very proud of that book.
Okay, well, congratulations on getting your rights back and getting the novel put back together, and also on winning the award for your sci-fi book. And yeah, the road to publishing can sometimes be very windy, can't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, so
The really interesting part of this, going back just a little bit, and don't try this at home, kids, because this could only work once, and it did for me, and I'm still not sure how. But when I was in London, that the year before, I don't know how many years before I actually got this thing published, and this thing existed as a book, but it was nowhere near publication. And I happened to be staying with a friend who had a printer, so he printed out the 250,000 word manuscript in a box, which was a lot of pages. And I walked in with this box to a very traditional, very hidebound, very old agency in London, which housed an agent who represented one of my favorite fantasy authors. And I asked to see her. And the very well-trained receptionist said, she's in a meeting. And I said, fine, I'll wait. So I parked myself in the waiting room with this box, and I just sat there. And the receptionist was kind of typing away and looking at me and typing away and looking at me and typing away and looking at me, and finally got up and went into the back. and came back with the agent in question, who was so completely nonplussed that somebody just walked in off the street and asked to see her, that she came out to see what I wanted. And I committed the second act of chutzpah, which is I took the box and I handed it to her and said, here, I have a book. And she was so completely blown away by the gall that somebody had to walk in and hand her a manuscript of a couple of 100,000 words that she read it. And she actually phoned me up in my hotel room in London. We had a long conversation about this. The problem was that she was in the process of retiring, which I hadn't known, and she wasn't taking on any new clients at all. So she wasn't really in a position to take it on. But she liked the book, and she gave me the name of 3 other agents, and one of them did take me on. So it's a question of, you can't do this again. This worked once. Yeah. This is a once in a lifetime story, but this book had a lot of these things accreting to it. It was
okay, yeah. I got to say that was definitely chutzpah to do that, but that's a great story. Okay, so tell us a little bit about the book. What's it about?
It started out as, when I started writing it, I wrote this scene. I wrote this section of a book, and it showed a girl with a small group of people who were helping her escape, and they were being chased by somebody else, and they were on a hill, and she was saying, well, from up there we would know. So it was an interesting little scenelet, and okay, there's a story here, and I started writing the story, and it took me about 2/3 of the book to get back to this point, to fill in the backstory, to show the people what happened, as in who she was and why she was there and what was going on. But the story basically turns on a young girl who is 9 at the time that her father happens to get killed in a battle. And she's the legitimate heir of a kingdom which is at war. And on the battlefield is a general who is very iffy about how he can hold his kingdom together with a 9-year-old kid in the throne. And when he's presented with an option, which is the king's bastard son, the king's bastard adult son, who is right there on the battlefield and who is a warrior and who is a soldier, and he basically says, you're it. I mean, we can't deal with the girl right now. Help us win this, and you're the king. So the guy obviously said, sure, I'll do that, which makes my girl, who is the legitimate heir, on the run. Basically, the story is about her trying to stay one step ahead of everybody who's after her, and eventually ending up in this strange, almost forbidden country where she finds out all kinds of interesting things about herself. And it transpires that she's so much more than just her own little human body. She's a part of something much bigger without anybody ever really being any the wiser. And this whole thing, her whole life was predicated on the fact that she had to be at a certain place and certain time to find out these things about herself and to learn about who she really was. And she's essentially a bridge between several different worlds.
Well, that sounds like a very epic and very interesting fantasy novel. So it also sounds like you kind of got a little inspiration maybe from some historical politics. Would that be accurate to say?
Nothing specific.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm from the Balkans. Let's put it that way. I was born into history and drowned in it. We of that nation tend to come out of the womb and take our first breath, and we get crammed full of history the minute we take it. So a lot of this is kind of intrinsic. It's instinctive. I'm just carrying it around with me. So it's not exactly some kind of a specific inspiration, like I'm picking this thing and writing about it. Although I have done that with historical fantasy novels before. I've got several historical fantasies out there, The Secrets of Jinshay and Embers of Heaven, which are kind of related, which is where the first book happens. It's kind of inspired by Imperial China. The second one, with Embers of Heaven, which takes place in the same world but 400 years later, which is vaguely tied into the Cultural Revolution China. So there's all kinds of interesting historical parallels there. And my third historical fantasy is Empress, which is the Justinian and Theodora story, really. So there's that kind of inspiration.
Oh,
It's
cool.
not one of those things that Western readers really know anything about. But again, this is part of my upbringing.
Well, I do, but it's actually one of my favorite historical time periods is the Justinian and Theodora story. So I'll have to check that out. Um, so tell us a little bit about the main character from Changer of Days.
Well, she kind of became my own alter ego. Online when I had to pick a name for a username, I would pick her name. So she's been following me around for many years now. She's part of my sort of internet life as much as my inner life. She's a remarkable creature. Um, she kind of goes through all kinds of interesting things, and the transformations that happen to her, she goes against the grain of a lot of things when she eventually ends up in Keldron, which is this strange country across the sea, and it's a sort of desert country. And honestly, I had a lot of fun with that thing. The desert country was a lot of fun to write. But they have a set of gods who exist on in terms of blood sacrifice. And when she gets involved in this whole gestalt in that country, she's basically powerful enough to be part of the, if you like, the priesthood caste in that country. But she's basically just saying, not for blood, not for death, not ever. I won't do this. And when she transforms the whole thing, which she does in the end, okay, spoilers, go away, go read the book. But when she does transform the whole thing, she basically does it according to her own light. And it's they who have to, to cleave to her lights rather than her making any concessions to what she does not believe in. But she does not believe that life can be bought by death, not ever. And that's what she lives by.
Okay, so what was the hardest type of scene for you to write in the book?
The hardest one?
Hardest type of scene?
Uh, the hardest scene. Huh. There are a couple of really harrowing things in there. Like when what we have here is the existence of something that in this land is called sight, but which is a kind of a magical gift type of thing. And Angara has it, but there's a lot of other women who have it. And her half brother has a chip on his shoulder that weighs a metric ton because the only reason he wasn't legitimate was that his mother did not have it, and therefore the king did not marry her. He married the other woman who bore this girl. So he's got this thing with sight. Why is sight so much better all the time? And when you finally, one thing too much, when she finally gets sheltered by a sighted sisterhood, and he just unleashes a pogrom. He basically just goes out and says, I will rule I will rule over a human country, and anyone with this is fair game. And what happens next is a nightmare. And it was kind of hard to get into that. I mean, he's also a character from my own head. It was hard to get into that mindset of somebody hating that much to do this kind of unspeakable stuff to people who really have no choice other than being what they were.
Yeah, but it sounds like you had a very good motivation for the villain character. So yeah. Anyway, so what is your favorite scene that you wrote in the book?
There are so many that I love in that thing. There's a particular scene which is the first indication of what she actually is when she faces down one of the old gods in the desert country, and basically they are in a very bad part of the desert, and her mentor, the old woman priestess who was her mentor, had just been bitten by a poisonous lizard and has literally died. And she's just stands up and says, no, not this life, not now. And she faces down the god of death and says, I will not have it. You can't have her. You cannot have her. I will not permit this. There's so much in that scene. There's so much power in that scene. And sometimes you kind of write something and you lean back from the screen and you look at it and go, wow, where did that come from? And this was one of those scenes.
Okay, so what are your characters afraid of?
Often themselves. Um, Depending on where they stand, they're afraid of, depending on who they are, as I said, mostly themselves. But there are a couple of characters who are leaning on the villainous side, who are very much afraid of losing. I was going to say face, but standing, their place, if you like, in their world. And the things they do because of that motivation, which is hard to defend. But in a way, you can understand a kind of human mind that only has one thing, and if they lose that one thing, they are nothing. They feel themselves to be nothing, so they will do horrible things in defense of that one thing that they are so absolutely attached to. So in that kind of sense, there's one character in there who's one of my best kind of semi-villains, Anson, who is Angara's foster brother and cousin. And he's not a nice guy, shall we say. But he's arrogant as anything, and he just feels entitled to slip away. He just turns to the bad. And he does some unspeakable betrayals because he's basically afraid that he's lost his place in the world that he's always assumed would be his.
Yeah, so he'll do anything to keep it, sort of a thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned the sci-fi book. Do you want to tell people a little bit about that as well?
Well, it's this one. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, a lovely cover on that, by the way.
My design, but someone else is doing. That's what I wanted on the cover. I just couldn't do it myself. Somebody else did the actual artwork, but I just said, this is what I want, and they did that. So that was my idea type of thing. But this thing started like a lot of my stories do, in a dream. And I woke up with a single sentence in my head, and the whole book kind of grew from that, like Topsy. And it's what you might call a literary science fiction novel. It's also been called a psychological thriller by somebody who did a review of it. So it's a lot of things to a lot of people, really. But it was a fascinating book to write. Because, I mean, let me just share with you a couple of lines from the back. The Parada, the ship, had been lost for almost 200 years before they recovered the ship, drifting in Stygian's interstellar darkness, and brought her home again. But that wasn't the miracle. The miracle was that the crew was still alive. That was also the problem.
Ooh, that's very intriguing in the blurb. Yeah, that's definitely a teaser to get people interested, I'll tell you. So I think we'll wrap it up here then. And thank you for being here. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you for having me.
And why don't you tell everybody where they can find you and your books?
Well, my website is almaalexander.org, not .com, .org. My .com one got bought up by a manufacturer of Chinese dog food or something. I don't know what happened there. It's .org, almaalexander.org. That's where I am. And when you go there, you're going to land on a book table which showcases all of the books that I have out there or have been involved with, novels, short story collections, anthologies, all kinds of things. You can start from there. And you can find me in all the usual suspects, Twitter, Facebook, the usual social media world.
Yeah, so definitely go check out her books. They sound fascinating. And again, thank you for being here. And Between the Pages, we'll be back next weekend. Not on Sunday, though, but we will be back on Saturday because Sunday is Halloween. And yeah, so we'll see you then. Bye for now.